This is a Book Arts Guild meeting on October 3rd, 2024. Our guest is Yuka Petz, and I have the privilege of introducing her. Yuka's creative practice is centered around paper, language, and text. Her work has been exhibited internationally and across the United States, and her artist books are in numerous special collections. In addition to working on her own art, she currently hosts the Artist Books Unshelved video series for the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, teaches youth and adult book arts workshops around the country, and has played a collaborative role in many community-oriented arts groups and projects. She is currently based in Tacoma, from which she broadcasts tonight. So with that, we'll begin with your presentation, Yuka. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I'm honored to have your time this evening, so I'm just going to get us going. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to set my slideshow. All right. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is a story about moving through generational silences to seek family connections across the Pacific. It's also a story about paper, specifically handmade paper. And it's mostly a story about seemingly innocuous moments that shifted the ground beneath me and upended what I thought I knew. So I want to ground us first geographically. I grew up in the US, spent the first 3 years of my life in Hawaii, and then mostly in Northern Virginia, and I've lived all around since then. My mother is from Japan. She's from Tokyo. And I have visited Japan a few times, mostly as an older, in my 20s and older. I also lived in Japan from 2003 to 2005. And there's that little circle on the left side. That's the teeny little island I lived on in the East China Sea, where I was an English teacher with the JET program for 2 years. But you might notice there's a big star in the middle of this map. This isn't all of Japan, but this is a good chunk of it. And that is on the island of Shikoku. And my maternal grandfather is from that space. So there's a prefecture called Tokushima, and he is from a small village called Wakimachi. And when I lived in Japan, I didn't know any relatives. My grandparents left Japan in the early 80s when my family moved to Virginia, because my mother's an only child and she felt responsible for them. So she didn't want them to go through their elderly years alone, essentially. So she convinced them to move to Virginia with us. And so we really didn't have reason to go back to Japan. My mother's an only child. So when I was living there, I kind of thought, it'd be cool to find relatives. There's got to be some relatives somewhere, but I didn't have any information, and my mother didn't know anybody. There was any connections were lost. But I did go to the Awagami summer workshop in Tokushima. And this is a week-long workshop that actually still goes on. I know someone who went this summer. So I went 20 years ago. I don't know exactly how it aligns with what happens now. But basically, it's a week-long workshop, and you are at the Awagami factory, which is in Tokushima. It's about 2 train stations away from my grandfather's hometown. And I'm going to just share a few slides of the process just to give you an overview. So on the first day of the week, you receive this bundle of kozo. So that's what you're looking at on the left. And that bundle is what you're going to make paper with. That's your bundle that you make your paper that you're going to take home. So everybody has their own bundles. And then you can see on the right, we start by cleaning the fibers and cooking them. And then we're cleaning them some more, and then we're beating the fibers. And you can see on the right side, there's a little baby Yuka beating the fibers. So in Japanese papermaking, you're pounding and kind of mashing and sort of sliding the mallet against the fibers. You're not cutting them. And so by not cutting the fibers, you get these very long fibers that allow for this paper to be very strong. So that's why washi, among our other papers that are formed this way, have a great strength. And then you make the paper. So here he's demonstrating a few different points in the process of the Nagashizuki paper making technique. So on the left, we're agitating the vat so that the fibers are dispersed evenly. And then in Western paper making, you dip your mold and your decal into the vat of pulp and you lift it up, right? And then you drain it. And that's your sheet of paper usually. That's the base of it anyway. But in the Nagashizuki technique, you can look on the right side, you have a suketa and you dip it into the vat and you actually kind of, you bring the fibers up in the water and kind of across the suketa, and then you dump it out. So you're actually, and then you keep repeating that process to build up the layers of the paper more slowly. So it's not just a one dip and you're done, it's a slower buildup. And then you have on the left, here's a sheet of freshly made papers. And you can actually press them right on top of each other. You don't have to put pellons or felts in between. And so this is the stack of paper that I made. And there's another picture of little baby Yuka spreading out, probably setting out wet papers to dry on this sheet. This area of Tokushima is well known for its indigo cultivation and indigo products. So while you're at the Awagami factory, or while I was at the Awagami factory, in the evenings, there would be different activities using paper like bookbinding and paper dyeing. We also had the opportunity to dye some paper in the indigo vat there. So it's a wonderful workshop. And if you have any interest in Japanese paper making, I strongly recommend it. It is very accessible, whether you speak Japanese or not. If English is your language, you're going to be fine. So I'm going to jump a little bit here to my grandfather and my maternal grandparents. So this is their wedding photo from 1945. They were married just before the end of World War II, like right before. And so that's obviously my grandfather and grandmother in the middle in the front row. And my grandfather was stationed with the Japanese military police to protect my grandmother's family. My grandmother's family lived in Taiwan as part of the Japanese colonization of Taiwan in the early 20th century. And they were a wealthy family. But my grandmother's father, who is on the other side of my grandfather in that front row, apparently he identified promise and good things out of my grandfather, and either arranged or allowed the marriage to my grandmother. So I believe this photograph was taken in Taiwan. I'm not 100% sure. And here's a little kind of a really quick overview of my family history. So on the top left, those are my grandparents and my mom when she was a young schoolgirl in Tokyo. And as I said earlier, she grew up in Tokyo, spent most of her, until she basically left home, was there. My mom was really good at English. She was a little smarty pants, like my grandfather. And she ended up joining Pan Am as a flight attendant in the early 70s and traveled the world, eventually moved to Honolulu and met my dad. And that's my dad in the center of the center photo. And that's actually my American grandmother in the photo with them. So my dad is of German and Irish descent from upstate New York. And he moved to Honolulu to work as a civilian, a welding engineer for the Navy. Now, one thing that you can't see in these photographs is that, as you might imagine, my grandfather had strong feelings about my mother marrying an American. They had, he had, at the end of World War II, my grandparents had lost everything. There's a story of how they came back on the train with basically like my grandmother had like 2 kimono and a pair of extra shoes, and everything was stolen by the time they got back to Tokushima. So they returned home with nothing. And I mean, war is hard for everyone. So I don't have a wedding photo for my parents. I believe in my memory, I think I've seen a photo of maybe them getting married in front of a judge, but I really question my memory at this point, especially after all the experiences I'm going to share with you tonight. But my grandfather either threatened to disown my mother or basically disowned her, essentially, for marrying my father. And that was it for a couple years. And then my older brother was born. And apparently the birth of the first grandchild softened my grandfather's heart. And so you can see in this right photo, there's my Japanese grandparents with my American grandmother and my older brother as a very young, chubby, cute little baby. So as I mentioned earlier, I grew up in Virginia, and I grew up in a multi-generational mixed Japanese and American home. I spent a lot of time with my grandparents. My mother raised me with English, but I spoke Japanese with my grandparents. So my comprehension is very high. My speaking has gotten a lot better, but was never very, very strong beyond a child's language. So let's go back to Japan for a second here. You can see on the bottom right, I've screenshotted this map from Google Maps, and that's the Awagami factory where I made that paper 20 years ago. And I had thought maybe I would go visit, Wakimachi, where my grandfather's hometown is. But again, I didn't have any connections. My mother didn't know anybody. I just didn't have any information. And the workshop was pretty full, so I didn't really have time, and I had to get back to work. But on the left side of this map, you can see all these blue dots. So last summer, I was planning a trip to Japan with my husband and my then 8-year-old daughter. And so I thought, let's go to Wakimachi. Let's go the, extra 2 train stops that I didn't make it 20 years ago. And we still don't know anybody or have any information, but I thought maybe I'll just go see it, right? I don't have to know anybody there. I can just go see it. So I armed myself with photocopies of all of the information I had from my grandfather. Photocopies of photos. I went through his scrapbooks, which I have, and I took scans of everything front and back, so I would have as much information. And I figured I'll just bring this, and maybe I'll go to town hall, city hall, find some information. Maybe there's a cemetery somewhere I can find somebody, a relative. Or maybe, it's supposed to be a small village. Maybe I can just bring these photos and just ask people on the street, which in retrospect is a really laughable idea because it wasn't that small of a town. It's actually pretty sizable. But that's how I went into this, just thinking we'll just go and see what happens. So this is the Yoshinagawa River, right in the valley by the mountains where my grandfather grew up. So the town of Wakimachi is actually just off to the right here. And here's just a few more scenes of what it looks like on the ground in the valley there. There's farms, there's beautiful rice paddies. We were there in July, I think. No, we were there in July, and it was or maybe the beginning of August. It was a beautiful time. The rice fields were gorgeous. And so I had actually been in Tokushima City nearby, about an hour away, and the host from where I'd stayed there was very generous and kind, as many Japanese people are, and he offered to drive us from the city to Wakimachi, to my grandfather's hometown. And because it's an hour, he likes driving. He's retired. He's got time. And so he drove us. We were a little early to check into the other guest house. So he said, "Hey, let's go to City Hall and we'll just see what we can find." And I said, "Great, that sounds awesome." And it was really extra nice because, of course, he is, a a Japanese person who is obviously very like completely fluent in Japanese. And so he has a little bit more facility, a lot more facility than my language, which I can get pretty far, but there's a very distinct edge at which it stops. So I went to the information desk at the town hall, and I had all those photocopies I showed you earlier. And Shin-san, the gentleman who was helping us, said, explained that I was looking for my family, and the woman at the information desk is looking at these photos and like asking if I have any other information that's maybe more helpful. And we come across this page, and she's like, "Ah, great." So what this is a photocopy of my family's registry from Yokohama, where my grandparents lived last in Japan. If you see on the bottom, there are kind of 3 bigger boxes, and in each of those boxes are my mom and my grandparents' names. So the rightmost box that has a big X through it, that is the section for my grandfather. So you can see his name has been X'd out, and there's a lot of information above, which is just kind of general biographical data. The reason it's X'd out is because my grandfather died, and when after he passed away and it was reported, they cross you out. So to the left of my grandfather's name is the section for my grandmother. And again, there's her name and some biographical information. She has since passed away, but when this photocopy was made, she was still alive. So there she is. And then on the far left is the section for my mother. So my mother is alive and well currently. So she is not X'd out because she passed away. She's X'd out because she became an American citizen, and you couldn't hold dual citizenship. Actually, she became an American citizen to bring my grandparents to the US. But the citizenship is a funny thing. When my brother was born in 1974, my mother looked into getting dual citizenship for him. But at that time, for him to receive that citizenship, the Japanese government would not recognize my father as his father. So my brother would have been registered within the Japanese government as an illegitimate child. So my mom said, "Heck no, I'm not doing that." By the time I was born, those laws had changed, but at that point, we're not doing it. Anyway, so we have this paper, and and I've had this paper for a really long time. I've had this paper since I lived in Japan. My mom had given it to me. You can see on the top left corner, it says translation on the back. I had written down the translations. What I didn't know was that I had an address. I had no idea. I can't read this document. I can pick out certain characters, but especially the handwritten stuff, I can't read it. And so I was in the city hall, and I had this moment of like, wait a minute, I've had this address this whole time and I didn't know it. And my heart kind of dropped a little bit. But we had the address now, so they sent us upstairs, and somebody printed out a map for us, and we went to the address. So Shin-san, remember the gentleman who was helping us just get into town, he said, "Great, why don't we drive by this address, and then we'll just drop you at your guest house." So we drive up. This is a very small residential street, and as we approach, I see my family's name on the outside of the fence, the wall there. So you can see it highlighted in the detail. So it says Matsuo. That's my mom's family's name. And I got really excited. I was like, "Oh my God, there's somebody here." They're still here. So Shin-san, the gentleman host from the city, he said, "Great, okay, why don't you get out and take a couple pictures, and then I'll drive you to the guest house you're staying, and you just kind of pay attention to the route, and then you can find your way back later and knock on the door or whatever." I said, "That sounds awesome." So I get out of the car and I start taking a few photos, and then there's a dog behind that right wall there, and it just starts barking, and it's just making a commotion. And my daughter gets out of the car. And some of you I know know what my daughter looks like. My daughter is very blonde. She is a young blonde child. If you can imagine traveling through Japan with an 8-year-old blonde child, let me tell you, it is an experience. So she gets out of the car, and then Shin-san gets out of the car. So we're all somebody comes out of the house to see why the dog is barking. So this woman comes out, and if you can just imagine standing where she is looking out on the street, there's this older Japanese gentleman, there's this little blonde child, and then there's me taking photos of your house. This is not exactly how I imagined or, possibly meeting my family. But it turned out this was my mother's cousin's wife. And I was extremely fortunate because she had heard of us. She knew, she knew that there were relatives in the US, and she was very kind and welcoming. They all were. So despite the sort of embarrassing start to meeting my Japanese relatives, I was immediately welcomed and embraced. So this photo, I don't know if this photo is from that property or from the home on the mountain, but my grandfather is in the front row on the left seated. Next to him is his father and then his mother. And then the 3 boys and men behind my grandfather are his 3 brothers. And that's my grandmother on the very, very far right. So all of my grandfather's brothers have passed away long ago. But their kids, my mother's generation, there are many still living in the area. I got to meet a really great number of them. I also met a few relatives of my generation, and we also met some relatives from my daughter's generation. There was a 10-year-old cousin who she made friends with, and I'm so hopeful that we can keep that connection going moving forward. And so my mother's cousin, they were so generous. They were retired, so they could take us around, and we drove to meet relatives, looked at all these different places in town. And he actually, so the mountain home where my grandfather was born is no longer accessible, but this is a view from the other side of the valley, and you can see this circled space. That's the place where my grandfather was born. And it was, even though I was on the other side of the valley looking at just trees, it was just amazing to be that close. And I dream of going and like just hiking through the woods and bramble and just seeing what's there. I also was able to hold straw sandals that my great grandmother made, which was kind of amazing. And that's a picture of her there on the left. And then they're very small, of course. So those are my daughter's feet in sandals made by my great grandmother, which was just amazing. So there were all these beautiful moments in this trip of discovery, of connection. But there were also some surprises. So here again on the left is my grandfather with his 3 brothers. They're a little older in this photograph. And my whole life, I had only ever understood that he had brothers. Well, as I was looking through photo albums with my newly found relatives, it turns out there was a sister who died in her 20s. I had never heard of her. I have my grandfather's photo albums and scrapbooks. I have not found any pictures of her. So that was kind of a shock, and it opens all these questions like why don't we know about her? What happened? Is it just because he didn't have a photograph? Is it as simple as that, or is there a deep pain behind this because of her passing? I don't know, and I don't know that I'll ever know. Um, but the biggest surprise was how much these relatives knew about me. They knew a lot about me. Um, and some of it is to be expected because my grandfather would call home. I remember him calling his brothers. But he died in the early 90s, and I was living in Japan in the early 2000s. And at one point, my mom's cousin's wife turns to me and she said, "We heard you were living in Nagasaki. We thought you might come visit." And my heart dropped because I didn't know they existed, but they knew I existed. And I don't understand. It didn't make sense because my mother, she told me that there's no connections. And my grandmother, it seems very unlikely that my grandmother would have stayed in touch with them because remember, she came from a very wealthy family. She was a very cosmopolitan woman in Tokyo. She had famous actresses for friends, I learned, talking to my mom's cousins. And she didn't really enjoy coming back to Tokushima, is my understanding, because especially at that time, as the young wife, you're pretty low on the family status, and you don't have some of the freedoms and privileges I think she would have been probably used to living in Tokyo in her cosmopolitan life. So I this moment just dropped me, and I don't know. There were photos of me in their photo albums. But this was the thing. So that was the feeling I came home. This question of, well, how do these people who I didn't know existed, how did they know so much about me? Because I would have absolutely gone and visited them while I was living in Nagasaki. 100% I would have made that happen. So I came home from Japan last summer and kind of with these feelings and these thoughts, trying to understand it. I'd asked my mom briefly what happened, if she had any ideas, but she just kind of evaded the question. I don't know that I'll ever really know the answer to that. And so I was kind of I was holding on to these mysteries, these feelings, this excitement, this sadness, just all of these feelings that this trip and meeting and finding my relatives brought up. And I was invited, shortly after I returned, I was invited to make an installation for the Minnesota Center for Book Arts Outlook Gallery window. And so I was thinking a lot about fissures and these kind of pressure cracks. And I work a lot with these cut paper letters in numerous ways. And I had been developing these tests to try to think about how I could kind of create a fissure in this 14-foot tall window and out of these cut paper letters and out of paper. And I haven't fully abandoned that, but I tell you what, it was really not going anywhere because I had to get this piece that I would somehow figure out how to make, and then I'd have to get it to Minneapolis and then get it back from Minneapolis. And there were just so many expenses and hurdles, and that seemed really beyond any budget I could have managed, not to mention the time that I had to develop something of this scale. So while I was kind of rumbling through those ideas and trying to figure out how to bring these fissure and of this pressure of this text and these letters coming out of this space, I was over at BIMA, at the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, in April, and there was a show up by Kumi Korf's work. She is a Japanese artist who lives in the US, who's lived in the US for a long time. And she has a number of multimedia works and prints and artist books. This on the right is the catalog from the show. I highly recommend it. And I'd like to be able to tell you that the show was amazing. When I look at the catalog, I can tell you that the show was amazing. But when I was in the gallery space, I was walking through and I pretty quickly saw this piece, which I have a photo from the catalog and a detail. And I don't remember anything else after I saw this piece. Because I saw this piece and I had a very immediate, visceral, emotional reaction. And I'm going to give you an inexact recreation of my thoughts after seeing this piece. So here it is. Pretty little scrolls of paper wrapped in colorful thread. Yummy little things. I did something like this in grad school. Maybe I should just cut up and roll the paper from origami, but it's just so precious. I don't want precious. I'm so sick of precious. You know what? I should just burn it. I should just burn that paper and be free of it. Then it's done and not sitting in my flat file, making me feel guilty that it's too precious to use and I don't have to carry it around anymore. Yes, I should just burn it. So somehow looking at that piece got my mind going to that paper that I had made 20 years ago at the Awagami factory that I've carried from Japan across multiple moves across the US, and it's just too precious to use. I never wanted to cut it up. I never wanted to print on it. There was just never anything that seemed good enough for those 20 pieces of precious, precious paper. So I said I should just burn it. In my process, I do have a sketchbook practice that I keep notes in, but I actually transfer all of my sketchbook notes into a running Word doc that I also keep notes basically whenever I touch the work or whenever I'm thinking about it. And I find that to be an extremely useful practice because I can kind of go back and see what I was working on or thinking, especially when I'm trying to write my artist statement. It's really useful to have that. In fact, from this sketchbook note came the title of the eventual piece. But here were my thoughts from burning the paper. So I thought this is right after I saw that Kumikorf piece and decided I should burn my Awagami paper. So burning the Awagami paper is important, holding on to a precious unknown, a place, a family. But then these surprises that jolt what you knew, creating a somehow new reality that you were always a part of, even if it wasn't the reality you knew. So I'm directly talking about discovering that my relatives knew more about me than I knew about them, and then all of these other little discoveries along the way of what I thought I knew. But I didn't burn the paper. I couldn't quite take myself to burning it. It just didn't ultimately make sense. It was too final. But somewhere along the way, while I was thinking about burning the paper, I remembered shifu. So shifu is a woven fabric made using spun washi thread. And here are a few examples of garments made from thread made from washi paper. And I thought, okay, well, this might actually be an interesting place to go. And I can think about transforming the paper into thread, right? And so here's another process note. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the key part there is the middle paragraph where making the shifu feels appropriate, especially from a paper made from plants and in a place so close to where Ojichima, my grandfather, is from. Why thread? I think thread is obviously a symbolic connection material. Maybe it's too obvious, but let's entertain it for now. This is the voice of my process notes to myself. But thread is also potential. It has potential. It's strong, it's weak, depending on the context. It's stronger with other threads. It can be made into something. So I decided to move towards this. And I committed to making paper thread from this so precious paper that I had made 20 years ago. So the process of making this paper thread begins with folding the paper a certain way. And this actually was the hardest step for me in the whole process. Um, I I worked on these papers over a few different sessions, and each time I kind of stopped and was like, well, maybe I don't have to do them all. But I had committed to doing them all. So you fold the paper, and which was just, it's the first action on the paper. So emotionally it was the most difficult, and it was surprisingly difficult. But then the next step is you cut the folded washi. And so here on the left is the folded piece that's been cut, and on the right is when it's unfolded. So you see the way that it's cut, there's all these strips in the middle, but it's still attached on the edges, kind of like a selvage. And in my research about shifu and kamiito, which is paper thread, I learned that there are different thicknesses that would have traditionally been cut for the different fine levels and fine qualities of the eventual garments. 2 millimeters wide for kimono to 10 millimeters for farmers' work clothes. So I opted for 10 millimeters because, of course, my grandfather's family were farmers and just worked and lived on the mountain. So after you cut the paper, you you roll it, you kind of bunch it up and you roll it against a surface. And so what the surface that I was able to figure out how to make was like a cinder block paver that I had lightly sanded down so it wasn't quite so abrasive. And so you dampen or humidify the paper, and you're rolling it back and forth and sort of fluttering the individual strings so that they don't get too tangled, and kind of rolling it back and forth. And over a few minutes time, it transforms. So you can see the top left, that's the paper that's been cut, but before I start rolling. And the bottom left is kind of along the way. And on the right, you can see how the paper, those individual strips have started to twist and start to almost, not quite thread, but start to form a thread-like um, substance. So here's another of my process notes. So one thing is being turned into something else, reflecting how my reality has changed, even though the base materials are the same. What I understood and knew, the paper, became something else which is born of the same information or material, but altered, the thread. So this is what I was thinking about as I was changing these flat sheets of paper into thread. And I think this is a really useful picture of just the kind of steps of the process: folding, cutting, and then after it's rolled, what it sort of transforms into. So I had actually every intention for this installation at MCBA to take all of these pieces of paper that I had made in Tokushima and actually make them into thread. And traditionally, the next step here is there's a way of tearing this whole sheet on the left so that it actually becomes one long piece of thread that you would then actually spin on a spinning wheel to truly make it thread. But after I had cut and rolled this sheet of paper and I put it on the wall because that's the safest place in my studio for something to be, I was really attracted to this object. I loved the drape. I loved the kind of overlapping and unevenness. I loved that it kind of evoked lines, um, like lines and lines of paper. And there was so much. And I kind of knew right away that this is what I wanted to make for the installation in Minnesota. That this is the point of the transition that I wanted to stop. And it made sense to me not to take it all the way to thread, because ultimately I still feel like I'm very much in transition with this new information and this newfound relatives. I don't, I feel like I'm still very much in the transition towards, I'm not sure exactly what is coming in next in the future as we kind of establish more relationships and maybe I learn more about my family. So it made sense to me to stop here. So I had about 20 sheets, and actually I had 20 sheets exactly. And I decided I was going to attach them all and make a really big column to hang in that 14-foot tall window. So here you can see on my studio floor, I'm gluing them together. And I'm fortunate to have a pretty long studio, and my poor dog had to be, for about 2 weeks, she wasn't allowed to come in the studio, and she was very unhappy about that. And so there they are, drying under weight on my studio floor. And then I sewed a high tensile strength nylon thread just to give some extra support, because over the course of the exhibition period, I wasn't sure if temperature and humidity fluctuations might give some challenges to that big column. So I wanted the nylon thread to support the whole piece hanging. So there's just a bundle of the column on the left there. But I remember earlier I was thinking about these fissures and these letters, and I knew I still wanted my letters in this installation. So I had laser cut a whole bunch of new letters. And one of the significant things, what these letters represent for me in this piece, but also throughout almost all of my work with them, is they are symbols of failure and potential, right? So they've fallen out of words, but they can create new words. So they exist in this space in between, where they kind of are symbolic of both failure and potential. So here is the installation at MCBA. The title is "The Reality You Were Always a Part of Wasn't the Reality You Knew." So again, we saw that part of my sketchbook earlier. So the column of paper rises up to the very top of the exhibition space, and then it comes down and kind of tacks to the wall and creates this sort of spread moment, and then dips down until it reaches the floor. And I have a very short video, just quick documentation, because it's hard to photograph this whole thing. There's no audio to this video, so don't worry. But it just takes you from the top, working down toward the base of the space. And I loved the raw space that the building had. It was a really lovely. Oh, this is the part in the presentation I always get a little stuck. There we go. So here are still photos of looking up, and you can see there's these broken dangling threads. And when I was making this, when I was rolling the washi to make towards this point in the process, sometimes the threads would break. And initially I thought, oh, I guess I'll just tie them back together, or maybe I'll just clip them out. But I ended up leaving them because ultimately they are so um, symbolic of so many parts of this, of obviously of like broken connections to ancestral homeland and my family and my relatives. Um, also, uh, just I didn't know how to make shifu before this. I don't know that I really do now. I consulted a few people, some books, but I was kind of just sort of teaching myself as I was doing it. So of course, I'm not going to be perfect, and things are going to break. And for me, that is very much in parallel to my experience of learning Japanese, of finding my relatives in Japan, where I'm just kind of trying to figure it out on my own, and I make mistakes like meeting my relatives while taking photos in front of their house, things like that. But they're there and they're part of the story. And so here's a photo of the base of the installation space. So this installation, you can view it from the outside windows, but from the MCBA shop, there's a little doorway that you can actually come in and look a little closer, and that's where this viewpoint is. And on the floor there are obviously the blue cut paper letters, but the red, yellow, and green letters, those are actually Japanese. So all the blue letters are English, but the others are Japanese. And those colors are very specifically chosen. I couldn't tell you if there was an artwork or a book or something in my childhood that I looked at, but for me, these are very Japanese colors. So here again is the view of the installation from the window, looking in from the window. And I'm just going to say my dog is snoring behind me, and I hope she's not getting picked up on audio, but if she is, I apologize. And then here again, another view. So originally, I actually had intended the column to just come down straight. That's really honestly as much length of the column as I thought I was going to have, but I ended up with so much more, which was a wonderful surprise, but also a challenge when I was on site trying to figure out what to do with it and kind of creating that tension against the wall, bringing it up to the side there, and then letting it kind of ooze out on the floor just felt really appropriate for the twists and turns of this story and kind of the way that all of this information and movement happens. Also, you can see on the back wall, it's that blue color. So that's a direct reference towards the indigo of that, that is cultivated and known from that part of the country. And here's just another detail. So if you're not looking closely, I don't know that you would necessarily know that those letters are in a different language, but if you look close, they're all in hiragana, which is one of the writing systems for Japanese. And it felt important to keep the Japanese separate and in slightly more organized piles. That's just what Japanese would be, I think. So I'm going to close out this presentation. I'm actually going to read a work in progress. It's very short, don't worry. This is a text that I had been working on around the same time I was developing the piece in the window. And I had actually originally intended to have it printed, maybe reso printed or a small broadside, and have it made available alongside the installation, but I didn't get it together in time. So it's doesn't explain the piece, but it's, I think, a fitting companion. I press my hand into the cool tile. Look, I show my mom. My hands are the same size now. 6 years older than me, I was always trying to catch up to my brother. I like the contrast of my skin with the shiny glaze on top of the 1970s brown. Yes, she says, but directs me to the pinky. The impression is straight, extending outward with the same directional confidence as his other fingers. My mother explains. His pinky is straight because he's a boy in our family. Yours, she points out, are bent. In my excitement, I didn't notice that my hand doesn't actually fit. My pinkies turn back toward my ring fingers, like young children hesitating behind their mothers. My mother holds her hands up, pinkies together. Obachma has bent pinkies too, she says. I see the curve. Now I can feel the ridge where my pinky juts out of the pressed clay. When my daughter is born, the first thing I check is her pinkies. I breathe the relief of continuity before examining the rest of her. Her hands are the same, as me, as my mother, as her mother, as how many mothers before. Our curve is strong, more pronounced than any other I've seen. I imagine a village somewhere, maybe in Japan, but maybe further back. All of the women here share our pinkies. If I turned up, they would know me. I explained to my daughter. She is around the same age I was when I made this discovery. We hold our pinkies up to each other. My husband's are straight, nothing like ours. Pride radiates from my breast. I won't let it go unnoticed. At my parents' table, the dishes are put up, and my daughter asks me to explain our pinkies again. My mother is blank. She doesn't know what I'm talking about. I assume she must have just forgotten. This sort of thing has begun happening. She holds her hands up. Her pinkies are straight. I'm so confused. I remember this. I'm sure I do. My chest falls in. The village evaporates. My pinkies are still bent. My daughters are still bent. Obachima died 4 years ago. Surely I looked at her fingers. I'm certain. I check. The tile is upstairs. Gray dust, undisturbed, on my brother's handprint. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuka. That was amazing.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the background. Oh, and let me just say first, I'm really glad you decided not to burn the paper.
Yeah.
I think
Me too.
I think what it became instead was really, really quite amazing. I'll ask a few questions, and I didn't see, and if anybody has any, then we'll just throw it open. I wanted to go back to the actual making of the paper. I was really surprised at how small the little pad was that you were beating the fibers on. Is
Yeah.
that traditional, or is that just for space in the workshop, or?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that.
Oh,
I'm gonna guess it was probably for the space of the workshop. But I don't know. I think probably it was workshop size, not actual production size.
oh, okay. I thought, well, maybe they just like a personal relationship with the fibers, or you only work in small batches to maintain the strength or something. So, and then you also mentioned that you didn't need felts between each sheet of the paper when you laid them out. Why?
Yeah. Yeah, the way that the sheets are formed, they actually hold their own continuity. So they have you might have noticed there were little sort of strings on the one end. So that's just to ease and separating them. But yeah, you don't need to. They'll get pressed that way, and they won't stick together.
Wow, maybe that's a function of of just those multiple thin layers on
Yes.
top of each other from forming it,
Yeah,
rather than just the glob of
of
felt
pulp.
from or well, I guess it's European style paper. Then the letters, the all those cutout letters, to me, they kind of look like they were the story that fell off that paper as it became those strips. That's a lot of paper letters. So you mentioned that you cut those on a laser?
I have those particular ones I have laser cut for me.
Oh, so you just commissioned someone to cut me
I have there's a
75
fabricator.
alphabets?
Yeah, there's a fabricator. And actually it's not just the alphabet. So this is true of this work and then all of my work with these letters.
Mhm.
But so it's not just the alphabet repeated. It's actually the letters appear in the same proportion as they would in English. Like if you know, where they,
Mhm.
however, so there's a lot more E's than there are X's, and the hiragana is the same. I looked up what the sort of the proportional appearance of each letter, and that's how roughly how they appear.
What other ways have you used those letters?
Oh, so I work with them sculpturally. I print with them. I draw from the stencils that I get back from the negative space I get back from the laser cutters. So yeah, they feature all over.
Wow, that was very interesting. There were just so many of them.
There's a lot. And the best if you're ever visiting my studio and you just want to put your hands in some piles of letters, it's gonna make your day. And we have open studio tours coming up. Is it next weekend? Not this weekend, next weekend. Tacoma open studio tours are next weekend. So I will have some letters out if you want to come put your fingers in them.
Oh, I forgot about that. I did see an announcement of that.
Yep. And I know that there's many people on this call, or I see a few Tacoma faces who I know are also going to have their studios open. So I highly recommend it if you're nearby. And you can just, I think you can just, I think it's Tacoma Studio Tours. If you Google it, you'll find it. I'm sorry, I don't have the link at hand.
All right, well, now that I've hogged the question time, let me ask if there's anybody else that has any questions that they'd like to bring out. Unmute yourself and shout it out.
Yuka, I'm curious if you know the next chapter of the piece when you take it down. Is the piece you did at MCBA gonna come home with you? Is it gonna have another life, or do you know?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it is going to come home. It'll be, the show closes on Saturday. Um, and I made it in such a way that I could still make thread from it. So I kind of always anticipated that I would probably take it to the next step and make thread. Um, but before I do that, I would love to show it locally.
Yeah,
I'd love to have give it a little bit of another opportunity to be on view before I um, irrevocably alter it.
it's just such a beautiful piece, and your presentation was fabulous for
Thank you.
all the dimensions of exploring your life, discovering your life, and I think also the way that you use those materials in time. Many of us can relate to that. A lot of us are tied to the materiality of our craft, and there's so much power in acquiring, hoarding, enjoying, these materials. And often there are the things that you never use
Yeah.
because it's too good, or because you're so tied to what you think it means. And I loved that aspect of transformation that you talked about. Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, I hope that there are a lot of entry points for people.
there are. Yeah.
I actually, when I gave a short presentation in Minneapolis while I was out there installing it this summer, and I was really touched. There were a couple of other second generation American who had been at the talk that came up and shared with me how much my experiences of these sort of broken connections and all of this really resonated with them too. So I was really honored that they shared that with me. And I hope that, wherever, I hope that there are a lot of places for people to enter into it.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think I'm gonna turn off the recording.
Oh,